Oh, awesome. It says I'm live. So great. So we are going to be talking about plugin architectures in .NET. The way that I frame this presentation is going to be a little bit more of an introductory view on this. So just a heads up, if you've been building plugin architectures for years and years, probably not a ton of stuff where you're going to say, oh, that's amazing. I never thought about that. But if you're new to it, I think this will be kind of interesting for you. I will touch on some .NET technologies and stuff like that, but it's going to be more generalized so that you can get introduced to this concept. So with that said, little overview. So I'll talk about who I am, what I do, so you understand who's talking to you. We'll go through some different scenarios. I'll talk about why I like plugin architectures and different, again, scenarios, how you can use them. I'll go through some tools, patterns, and practices for how I like to apply plugin architectures. We'll talk about trade-offs and gotchas because I think that with anything in software engineering, we absolutely need to talk about pros and cons. It's kind of challenging when I talk about stuff I like. It's very easy to say, hey, look at all these good things, but I don't think it's fair if we only talk about good things because my goal, like I don't get like paid for people to go make plugin architectures. That would be super cool. But I want you to be able to take the information and do good things with it. If that means you're not building plugin architectures, that's totally cool. But at least you have another tool that you can lean on. And then finally, towards the end here, I'll talk about how I leverage plugin architecture. So we'll go through some more specific examples because I think personally, when you see some of the theoretical stuff, you see how some of these things look and feel. That's nice, but maybe I can do a little bit better of a job in showing you, like in the stuff I build, here's some examples of what that looks like. So who am I? I'm Nick Cosentino. I am a principal software engineering manager at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft now for about 4.5 years. I just realized I said about. I am from Canada, so if I say about and I say sorry a lot, it's because I'm Canadian. So I've been in the Microsoft 365 side of Microsoft for the entire time, the entire 4.5 years. I started on the deployment team. So in Microsoft 365, we call it Substrate, the platform that is what all of the services are built on. So the Substrate deployment team. So we were responsible for deploying hundreds of services to hundreds of thousands of machines across the planet, which is super cool. And then earlier this year, I actually transitioned to another team in Substrate, which is the front end routing plane. So basically, all of the requests that are coming in, my team, or the larger part of the team that I'm on, I'm responsible for part of it. We handle routing for trillions of requests per day. So it's a pretty interesting scale consideration. Prior to that, though, I spent the majority of my career at a company called Magnet Forensics. So I spent 8 years there. And I guess like almost as soon as I started, kind of a crazy thing, but at a startup, they made me a manager pretty early on. So I've been managing teams and building software for my entire career. So it's been about 12 years of managing teams now. So yeah, that's me in the picture, and then my wife there, and then I have two of my dogs here. We have three dogs and now two cats, so a bit of a zoo. I do live in Seattle area now, and then I make stuff on YouTube as well. So if you recognize me, it's maybe from my YouTube channel. It's called Dev Leader. And I always joke that like YouTube stuff is fun. I like to be able to make educational videos and help people out. But if we go over to the next screen, I'm definitely not quitting my job to go full time with YouTube anytime soon because the $1 to $3 a day is probably not going to pay the bills. But yeah, that's it's still a fun thing to go do, and it's great if I can help people along the way. So okay, so let's consider scenarios here. So I just realized too, my camera's directly in front of the slide. So if you see me like bobbing and weaving, it's because I'm trying to read with this big stupid camera in front of my entire screen. So I do apologize. And one more thing I should mention too, in Seattle area, there is apparently called a bomb cyclone that's happening. I've lost power once earlier today. Fingers crossed we're good. So I do apologize if I happen to disappear partway through. It's not because I don't want to be here. It's just because the weather might be a little wild. Okay, so some different scenarios to think through, and then I'm going to try to explain how plugin architectures can tie into this. So let's think about a command line tool. Maybe you want to convert pictures. It could be other types of media, but for this example, you're going to build this command line tool to convert pictures, and you're going to start converting bitmaps to PNGs. And you go build this, you build out that conversion. And then now that you have this in place, you might say, okay, well, if I have bitmaps to PNGs, like what if I wanted to convert to JPEGs or WebP files? Or what if I wanted to kind of mix which input I have and what output I'm getting? So that's a scenario that we'll see. Like that could be interesting for plugins, web APIs, and ASP.NET Core. So as .NET developers, probably many people watching this have built things in ASP.NET Core or are interested in doing so. So you've in this scenario, you've built the endpoints your product team has asked for, right? So they said, go build like, you have like a shopping cart, like a checkout, you have reviews or something like that. So now they're coming to you and saying, great that we have all of this stuff we asked for, but in typical fashion, product owners always want more things, right? So they're saying, cool, great, we have all this. We want you to go add this new functionality now. So you have like user endpoints, you have product endpoints, checkout, reviews, etc. So you want to go add another whole category of things that you can do on the web API. Some additional scenarios. So you're building a desktop app. And by the way, I'm giving you these different examples because I think that it's not like plugin architectures just apply to like web apps or just to desktop apps. It's like you can think about these things in many ways. So in this example, I want you to think about something like Visual Studio. You're probably all familiar with that. Photoshop, different Adobe products, right? Like these powerhouse tools, right? So you might have your core functionality kind of built into the tool, but because there's so many opportunities for different features to be built in, different workflows and things like that, like how do you go start extending this, right? And then something else to think about, which we haven't really touched on in these examples yet, is who's doing the extending? Is it just your core development team? Like, is it just in-house you're building things to keep extending the features? Or like, can your customers do that? Can end users start to make things that extend your application? And then the final one I wanted to add in here, because I think it hits home for, at least for me, it hits home. I think a lot of people start out, I don't know if this has changed in more recent times, so maybe I'm dating myself a bit, but you're building the next big, massively multiplayer online role-playing game. So I think a lot of people start like this. I think for me, initially, I was like, this would be so cool. And you're like, okay, I'm going to get started building this role-playing game as the very first thing you try and build, which is kind of funny in hindsight, right? But so you're building this thing, you have core systems in place, you have some content for your game, but like, how do you continue to just keep growing and evolving this game, right? So the example I gave here is like, if you're trying to beat out World of Warcraft, you need to be having this role-playing game running for 50 years. You have to keep adding new systems in. How might you go do that? So why build plugin architectures, right? So we're going to talk about how in these examples we'll see come together a little bit more, but the different features that I like about plugin architectures. And I'm not trying to list these out as like these are the definitive things. If you think of other examples, I'm sure there's other good reasons, but I've kind of grouped them into these four. So modularity and isolation, extensibility and flexibility, reusability, and testability. A lot of the content I create too, I like to talk about testing software. And one of the things that I lean into a lot is I build a lot of plugin architectures, and the way that I test, I find like lends itself well for how those things are designed. So, and then I said like the last sort of benefit is to fill the ever increasing void that we all have to add more levels of abstraction and complexities to our applications. So there is a bit of foreshadowing there because plugin architectures do come with some complexity. So we will see that in a little bit. Okay, when it comes to being modular and isolated, so remember how you keep hearing about low coupling and high cohesion, right? So you want to define relevant areas of code that are like functional areas of code together. That way you don't have like features and stuff spread out across everywhere. So when we're thinking about building plugins, we're actually grouping relevant features and functionality into one spot, into one plugin. I like to say like we put physical boundaries up. By isolating code within modules. Sorry that you can see me bobbing and weaving. It's kind of weird to say like physical boundaries because we're talking software. It's not physical, but if you're talking about like C#, for example, we're talking about our CS proj files. Like I like to think about leveraging project files as boundaries. Now you don't have to do this, right? You can design modular software and you don't have to go make a million projects. But when I'm building plugin architectures, I like to to segregate like different functionality into separate projects. And that's almost like a forcing function for me to be able to have that capability that I do have a dedicated plugin. I also wrote here, like in terms of being modular and isolated, I say ideally. I don't like having like concrete rules that apply like always or never. I don't like those words. So I say ideally plugins should not reach into other plugins. So for example, if you're building different features in these plugins, if they're directly referencing code in some other plugin, like that's probably a bit of a code smell, let's say. Again, are there ways that you could do this? Sure. Are there situations where that might be a good fit? Sure. But I would say if you find you're doing that, you may want to try and find a way to pull out that code so that you don't have plugins kind of reaching across boundaries like that. And then something else, I think people hear this a lot now, but like vertical slice architecture, right? But I also talk about just like vertical slice development. Just a quick note on this. There is a concept called vertical slice architecture. When I talk about vertical slices too, I like to mention that you can just develop software from the perspective of approaching it in vertical slices. So you're going to build a feature, you're starting from like the top to the bottom. So your user interface, how that's going to flow through everything, go to the database, let's say, and all the way back up. So you're building it truly in a vertical versus just like very wide layers in like a layered architecture. So plugins, I think, can really help with that. So what I wanted to show in here is just like a quick, my visuals are pretty bad, by the way. If I make stuff in Paint or like why can't I think of the word? I'm using it right now. PowerPoint. Thank you. If I'm using PowerPoint for my graphics, they're all pretty bad, so I apologize. But and something else, I think StreamYard is. I uploaded the slides here, so if it looks like some of the stuff is kind of wonky, like that says shopping G cart, it's supposed to say shopping cart, so I apologize. It's just how it formatted here. But in general, you might have like your core application. And I find usually when I'm building plugin architectures, my core application is pretty thin. And it doesn't have to be. You can have a pretty heavyweight core application. So I would say like this is your ASP.NET Core Web API in this example. And then we're pulling in plugins that implement these different feature sets. So you can have like a whole plugin dedicated to authentication, a whole plugin dedicated to having like a shopping cart in your e-commerce setup, products, reviews. So you can build plugins that are dedicated to these endpoints or sets of features. So that's one way that you could start to think about this stuff. And then just to call it out, I have this little thin layer in these like little grayish white boxes. And that's just like the sort of the API that you would be using from your core application to your plugin. So we'll get into a little bit more of this later. So extensible and flexible. So there's a concept that I'll be talking about even later in this presentation called assembly scanning. So with assembly scanning and plugin loading, we can basically, it's kind of a weird concept, but you can introduce functionality at runtime. So what that means is that you might build your core application, and we have that built, and I can say deployed. I don't necessarily mean it has to be deployed to the web. It could be installed, right, like on someone's machine, depending on what you're building, right? But what's interesting is that with assembly scanning and plugin loading, you can take some other, binary that's been built, drop it in to a folder in some location, and there's other ways that you can do this. But at runtime, without having to go rebuild everything, you can just dynamically load up code. And I think that that's a super cool bit of functionality. It's a bit of a unique thing. So you don't have to like go rebuild everything to get new features being added. So I think that's a really powerful thing for plugin architectures. And I was writing here, the same application can be configured with different plugins to completely change the provided functionality. So I think in the next slide, if not, it's coming up soon. There's a graphic that I'll walk through that shows like you can basically just swap out pieces of it. And a way to think about this too, if you're thinking about like object-oriented programming, if you had interfaces and a different concrete implementation, right? Think about it like an iRepository, and you have one for Postgres and you have one for MySQL. Like you could totally swap out that concrete implementation if things are using the interfaces. And we can kind of do the same thing with entire plugins, which I think is really cool. And then the other thing that I wanted to add here is if we go back to those example scenarios, I don't know if you can recall all of them, but I wanted you to think about like external and internal extension of the application. And what I mean by that is like who's actually doing the extension. I brought it up for one of them, right? So if we're thinking about Visual Studio or other desktop suites, right? Who is building plugins for that? Who's extending that functionality? And if you're building your own web API, let's say, maybe you don't plan to have end users like adding plugins for your web API. That might be a little weird. But maybe you're working in a larger organization with multiple teams. It's one application, and maybe different teams are responsible for different sets of plugins. So that's something to consider is like who is creating the plugins. When I'm building stuff, it's either, on my own, I'm the plugin developer. I don't think I've ever released anything on my own where I have external users making plugins, but I have worked in these scenarios in the past in a professional setting where that has to be considered. So I think it's just an important factor when you're thinking about plugin architectures. So the graphic I think comes after this one because it ties into this as well. So reusability, we can actually take plugins, different code from plugins, and repurpose them in different ways, which is very interesting. So I wanted to give a few examples here. So we'll talk about an application that has like a basic mode and an advanced mode, and all that you're doing is taking the same application, but for your advanced users, you can turn on more plugins, right? So they get more features that are added. You didn't go recompile it. You didn't even have to go remove the basic features. You could have left those in and just add more plugins dynamically, and then those get loaded up. There's this concept of, and I think the term is called white label. I might have that wrong, so I apologize if that's a misuse of the term. But the concept here is that you build some software. It's been customized or end users want it customized. So you build it, and then you have a customer that's like, okay, but we want this theme and these features. And then you have another customer that says, we're interested in that, but we want this other theme and these features. And you can essentially re-release the same core set of functionality and provide plugins that tweak the behavior. So that could be something for leveraging plugins. And this third example, I said you have plugins for your core application. And again, it doesn't matter if it's a web app, desktop app, whatever it happens to be. But you could, and I'll talk about a specific example of this. You can swap, not the plugins this time, but you can swap the core application and keep the same plugins. So I'll talk about that in just a moment because I think it's an interesting use case. It kind of flips things on its head. So back to more of my poor graphics and the formatting. I mean, don't get me wrong, my graphics weren't good to begin with, but the the upload to StreamYard isn't doing me any favors here, so I do apologize. So I just have 3 different scenarios from the previous slide, okay? And I just want to kind of walk through them and kind of explain them with some pictures. So in the first one, we talked about basic versus power users. So in the basic setup, you're only turning on 2 plugins, and you're taking the same core application and you're just adding in plugin 3 and plugin 4 in this example, right, for having more functionality added in. The white label application one that I gave that example of same core application, and maybe you have a single plugin or a couple of plugins that can customize what you're doing. In this case, for the white label application, it might even be overly complicated to have plugins for. You might be able to do it just with configuration, but especially if you have logic that you want to be added on and changed, like plugins could work well for that. And the final example, and I'll actually talk about a specific example here, is swapping out the core app. So you'll notice the same 4 plugins on the left and the right side. But what we're doing now is it's a web API in one example and a console application in another. And the example that I have for this, I've actually used this a handful of times and it's worked really well. When I'm building ASP.NET Core web APIs, there are situations where I find I'm debugging things and I want to like interact with my live service. Now, instead of building out like a whole management portal and like a management API and just adding more and more code, there's sometimes I'm just like, I want a debug console and I can work through some things. So because I build most of my things with plugins, so like say the left-hand side, this core application is a web API, I basically just take off the web API, so I'm not serving endpoints anymore, and I put a console application on top of it. Then I can write console commands, and then I can interface with all of my own logic that would be executing in production, which is super cool. It helps me do things like if I wanted to write a little command line app to say like, hey, like what functionality does this user have enabled? I could write a command that does it, and it's using all of the same code that I do have in production already. So I think that's a super helpful use case that I've had. So again, it's swapping the core application itself instead of the plugins. We'll talk about testability too, and this is really not like it's not unique to plugins. I think it's just that something that you benefit from the other characteristics, right? So I talked about modularity, isolation a little bit earlier. So when you have things that are segmented like this, in my opinion, it lends itself well to being testable. And the reason I say that is that if you're touching one plugin, you can't guarantee that it's not possibly going to affect something else in the app, but you have a higher degree of confidence that given that it's one plugin, you're not touching other plugins directly. So in theory, you should have way higher likelihood of not breaking other stuff just by staying within your plugin. Obviously, this is nuanced, but in general, I think that this is a really nice characteristic of being able to build out plugins. I would say that where, like, again, I want to give you some trade-offs, right? So more attention for integration tests. So if you're thinking about your plugin working in isolation, just to give you an example, maybe you tested all of your plugins and you have 100% code coverage, and then you go to deploy your app and it launches, but there's no functionality. And you're like, well, what the heck? All of my tests pass. How is there no functionality turned on? And then you realize, oops, like we didn't actually check to make sure that any of the plugins got copied in when we installed it. So there you go, right? Like you disabled all of your plugins by accident. So I think you need to consider how these things get pieced together, because that's just a unique thing about the plugin architecture style. Okay. So when it comes to testing, you'll also notice I use the word confidence a lot. I think everyone has their own take on testing. If you've seen things that I put out, when I talk about testing, I talk about testing to build confidence. For me, that's the reason we test. If you want to have confidence in delivering changes, test. What types of test? Up to you. The ones that give you the most confidence. I think that's the answer to it. So this is going back to one of the earlier examples where I was talking about having, say, your product owner said, great, we have all these features. Let's add one more. So they want to add reviews. That's going to be plugin 4 is this new one, right? So if you have these other plugins that are completely separate, and let's talk about the tests you have over top of them, right? So you have lots of unit tests on plugin 1 and integration tests. Great. For the shopping cart, same idea, and you're getting some tests interacting with the database, so on and so forth for plugin 3. So what happens when you do plugin 4, right? Like if you're going to add this, do you have to, like, suddenly are you losing confidence in the code that's in plugin 1, 2, and 3? Or should you feel pretty confident that because plugin 4 is brand new and isolated, stuff in plugin 1, 2, and 3 should be, again, I'm not guaranteeing it, but like should be pretty safe. So I think that overall, I'm hoping this picture kind of helps show that, like, if you're looking almost like a heat map of the different parts of your application, the new stuff that you're adding should be the part where you have low confidence because it's new. And then you go add the test to that. But adding something new should not reduce confidence significantly to any other part of the app. So I hope that helps from the testability side. Okay, tools, patterns, and practices. So dependency injection is hopefully something that most people know. And I kind of saying it in a joking way, but it's about to be your best friend if you want to work with plugins. I think that it is tremendously helpful. And reflection in C# and .NET is, I think, another sort of powerhouse tool here. The reason why these things come up is because they're tools that actually enable you to do dynamic resolution. right? You can technically build plugins and have them all available at compile time. I'll actually talk about a bit of a cheat that I use for that in a moment. But in theory, like, you're probably designing these things to be dynamically loaded. So in order to do that, dependency injection and reflection are two great tools for helping with that. Um, for dependency injection frameworks, there are lots of them. Someone's actually sent me a repository and I don't have it handy. I apologize, but there's a big list of all of these frameworks and what they do. Personally, the built-in like iService collection stuff from Microsoft has come such a long way. When I started, no offense, like, I work at Microsoft, but I'll say this, it felt pretty crappy and AutoFac was around. So I gravitated towards AutoFac. I've been using AutoFac for years and years, but now I'm like, I don't know, like, the built-in one has come such a long way that I'm starting to move away from AutoFac, especially because most things are integrating with iService collection and it seems pretty natural. Um, there's, I don't know how to say this word, and every time I go to talk about this this NuGet package, I feel embarrassed. But Screwdoor, I believe, is the name of it. It's also something that can help with this concept of assembly scanning. So AutoFac, really good for assembly scanning and dependency injection, and Screwdoor and iService collection that's built in are another good combination you can check out. But there's plenty of them. I'm not here to prescribe any of them to you. I think use what makes sense. But I did want to call out that for my personal use, AutoFac is where it's been in the past, but iService collection, I'm going more towards that. Okay, so you've heard me talk about assembly scanning a little bit, and I just want to explain this concept a little bit further. So when I talk about assembly scanning, it's this idea of like where are your plugins coming from, right? So we need to be able to go look for assemblies, so your different DLLs that have plugin code. We need to go find those. So where do you get them from? So scanning the running directory that you're in, let's say, so your bin directory. Maybe you have a dedicated plugin folders, and you could group these into different things. Like, there's no rule, but you need to come up with the pattern that you want. Maybe your plugins have a naming convention, something like that. But you need to put some thought into, where am I getting these things from? I also wrote here, like, you can get plugins over the wire technically. Like, it doesn't have to be locally on a folder. You could get pretty crazy with your design and actually have something running and then dynamically pull plugin code from some other service, download that binary, and now you have it available to use. So I think there's lots of really interesting opportunities, but generally when I talk about assembly scanning, it's looking through files on disk to load up DLLs. So assembly scanning is going to help with which plugins you have to work with, and then how you're going to actually connect those plugins to your core application. So we're going to see this in just a moment, but the idea, I brought up dependency injection already. You're able to do things like leverage your dependency injection container and register types from your plugins, and or the other way, which gets kind of interesting. There's definitely trade-offs for it. So I got some code here. It's pretty nasty. There's a big link statement with a bunch of stuff going on here. So I just wanted to explain. I'm not suggesting like this is the best way to do it or anything like that. I just wanted to give you an example of what this could look like. So if we have this collection of assemblies, so again, you need to figure out where these are coming from. Where did you go load these from? So did we look on our local install path and we're looking in a folder called plugins? You can use the system diagnostics namespace, I believe, to be able to get the assembly loaded up from a file path. Now we have this list of assemblies, and what we can do is select all the types from there. And then we're going to do some filtering on here. So this one is a pretty nasty set of conditions to check for. But the idea is like we're looking for, and this will change, by the way, depending on what you want to do for your plugins. But I'm looking for basically public types that are classes, and they're not an AutoFac module, which is a specific thing for AutoFac. And then this container builder is an AutoFac concept for dependency injection. We're going to register that type. We're going to register that type as the interfaces it implements and its class itself. And that way people can ask for it either way. This is actually something that I have written in some situations that does the work mostly of Screwdoor. Screwdoor is interesting because it will do almost something exactly like this. And then it basically applies the same rules for dependency injection. So, like, for example, as implemented interfaces, as self, um, and single instance. I forgot to mention that, by the way. So, if you're familiar with iService collection, this is like saying singleton on your dependency container. But Screwdoor basically applies the same rules across the types that it's registering. But same type of idea here. And then on top of that, if I'm using AutoFac, you could do something like also register all of the AutoFac modules from those assemblies. So if you're not familiar with AutoFac, it has this concept of a module that you can declare, and the module itself basically allows you to write code that registers dependencies on the container. So you might see like from the container builder, register type, blah, blah, blah. You might see that type of code written out like 100 times for different types. Now, I find because I register things almost always the exact same way, that writing something very generic like this gets me like 99% of the way. And then I handle some edge cases. But that's what the modules kind of allow you in AutoFac. So something to think about. And then this example shows that we're actually hooking up AutoFac with a service provider. So that actually allows it to integrate with ASP.NET Core as well. So just an example. It's not the only way to do it, but that's using AutoFac. Okay, so this question comes up a lot. So do you actually need dynamic plugins? Do you need to be able to load a plugin while your application's loading and have features turn on without restarting the application? The other thing that I have here is, do you need startup time for each plugin, right? So do you need to configure plugins for the lifetime of the application? Like, there's these different considerations you need to make. And if you're reading this and hearing me say it, you might be thinking, well, what happens if I want to turn it off, right? So I think these are questions that you need to consider when you're building plugin architectures, because if you neglect them and then they come up later, you might say, oh crap, maybe I designed how these work in a way that's not going to lend itself well for our architecture, our application. So it's interesting. I find I often write plugin architectures and I don't actually need dynamic loading. I don't actually need my service to be running or my desktop application to be running. And then while it's running, I'm like, okay, let me go turn on this feature by loading in this assembly. I actually don't really need that for almost all my use cases, but I end up doing it on startup. So I end up dropping in binaries, right? So when something's being deployed or being installed, there's these extra binaries that got packaged in. And when the application starts up, I will dynamically load those. So it's kind of dynamic, but it's not from like, hey, the app's been running for 20 minutes. Now I want to go load one. But if you have that use case, that's absolutely something you can do with plugins. And then the other thing that I mentioned here, right, is for the lifetime of the application, because if you do want to unload them, that has some interesting complications as well. Total transparency. I don't know if in any production code I've ever written, I had the use case where I needed to unload plugins. It's doable, but it's a bit of a mess because you have to deal with app domains and things like that. And I've just never had that use case, so I have not spent a lot of time doing it. But it is extra complication. Okay, this one's super messy, and I apologize. I'm laughing because all the words like telemet, rye, and database, pretty ridiculous. But let's kind of chat through this. I think that there's some interesting considerations that you need to decide on for your dependency injection when you're working with plugins. And I think it's a matter of like deciding who is responsible for allowing influence over different things. So to give you an example, in the first row, you might say, okay, look, I have these plugins that I want to enable. So plugin 1, 2, and 3. And these plugins, they're responsible for their own dependencies and stuff, right? Like they know what's going on, but the core application will provide some core set of dependencies over to these plugins. So I have listed, I just realized I don't even know if you can see my cursor, so I apologize. But under core app, um, I have plugin loading, logger, telemetry, database. Like these are the responsibilities of the core app. Now, what you might do is say, cool, the core app has those responsibilities. That means for plugin one, if it needs a logger, I can give that to plugin one from the core app, right? That's the direction we're heading in. And if it needs telemetry, that's cool. The core app has you covered because these are like core features that we've defined in the core app, and they can share those things over. Now, the other thing that's not really illustrated here is that the plugins themselves provide features back to the core app. So that's where we would use assembly scanning to start pulling in those feature sets. But you can kind of break this down even more. If you're adverse to this because you want things owned by the core application, that's totally cool too. However, this bottom row, I actually move a lot of stuff in this direction actually, and it's because I over-index on making plugins. I will totally admit my bias for plugin architectures leads me to doing things like this, but I find it's nice to work with. In my experience, your your experiences may differ though. So in this bottom one, what I'm showing here is instead of having the core application, provide things like logging, I actually have a plugin that provides the logging. I have a plugin that provides the telemetry. And then on top of that, it would also, I didn't have enough space, but it would also provide the features from the other plugins. This way, my core application becomes so light that there's almost nothing inside of it except for plugin loading. Now, from my own development, I've kind of gone down this path a lot. If you look at, I don't know, in the last few years, like anything that I built, the core app is very lightweight, has dependency injection set up. It has some like global error handling just for diagnostics. And otherwise, like, cool, I need logging. That's a plugin. I need telemetry. That's a plugin. I'm extending the feature set. Those are plugins. And the thing that you have to consider here, like I was saying at the beginning of the slide, is who gets to have control over the dependency container? Because if you're providing that dependency container for other plugins to register stuff, they get full control over it. When might you not want that? If we think back to what I was saying earlier about who gets to have the ability to extend your application, if you have end users that have full control over this stuff, you might say like, I actually don't want an end user to be able to inject their own licensing logic, right? Probably not if your if your software is licensed. So you might not want this bottom path. You might want to say, look, the core app will provide those core dependencies to the plugins. So hopefully that makes sense. But these are considerations you need to have in terms of who influences what. This is a screenshot that might scare some people, so I apologize. But this is actually a screenshot. I know it says 27 projects. I think I'm probably over 100 now. I'm not bragging about that, by the way. I'm just giving you visibility into what's going on here. So this is a project that I started. It's actually something I'm building called Brand Ghost. You'll hear me talk about it online. But these are basically examples of features and like core functionality as plugins. So anything under this features folder, by the way, pick whatever convention you want. I'm not here to prescribe anything. You can see I have like a folder saying factor out, like I need to go do some refactoring. So things are always a work in progress, but like I have an entire authentication feature, an entire one. I have an entire logging feature. These are like from the previous slide, these core features as plugins. But Brand Ghost, I know it says platform hooks here. Brand Ghost is this application we're looking at. It posts things to social media. So when we see like Twitter here, or we see Pinterest or Meta, LinkedIn, these are actual features built as plugins. And they're good examples of plugins, in my opinion, because they're the different social media platforms that I want to interact with. They're entirely separate vertical slices of functionality in dedicated plugins. I can go add a whole new social media platform and not worry that it's going to affect anything else. So this thing does use assembly scanning. It has dependency injection. So this is using AutoFac. And this core application, so if we look at the very bottom where it says platform hooks.app, you can't tell from looking at it here, but there's almost nothing inside of it. Almost nothing. I don't know if I have a slide on this, so and I can't see the upcoming slide, so I just want to say it out loud. I mentioned earlier I have a cheat code. I have a cheat code for doing plugin stuff. And this might be a spoiler if I have it on an upcoming slide, so I apologize. But the idea, one of the challenges we have with plugins is you see all of these different projects that I have here. I know some people are looking at this going, oh my God, like I could not survive like that. I get it. That's cool. I'm not telling you have to do it this way. This is me putting physical boundaries in place so that I don't try touching the code from the other projects. Now, one of the complications that we have when this stuff is getting built out is how do you make sure all of these things end up when you're like in the output from your deployment? Because now it's not just press build in Visual Studio, take the bin folder and go push it somewhere. You have to say, cool, if I build it, I get the core app. But what about all these plugins? How do I get them into the destination directory? So my cheat code is that it enables me to actually do what I just said, which is I can press play or build in Visual Studio and everything goes to the right spot. So it's a bit of a cheat, but let me explain it. I use a project called Bootstrap. Bootstrap is empty. Bootstrap does nothing except it references all of these other projects here. And you might be saying, well, that seems kind of suspicious. Like, why are you doing that? And then I go from my core application, I reference Bootstrap. And the idea is, yes, it does enable my core application to technically see the code inside of these. Technically, you can use the internal access modifier to help with that, by the way. But it technically allows for that. But because my core application has almost nothing inside of it, if I ever found myself writing code that was like features.linkedin. something in my core application, huge red flag. Like it wouldn't even fit in there in the code. So when I leverage this pattern, what it gives me the ability to do is literally just right click in Visual Studio, build the core application, and all of the plugins end up where they need to be. So the reason I do this is because if I do not, then my CI/CD pipeline for building and deploying becomes much more complicated. I've chosen that I don't want to have that complexity. I think long term, especially if you're working on different teams and different teams have responsibilities for different plugins, you probably do want to consider like having that managed in your CI/CD pipeline to organize your dependencies. I just don't have that that need for what I'm doing. So I do use this cheat, and that way I build, I clean, everything just works in Visual Studio how I would expect. Okay, I can't even see what this title says. Oh, how do you even use them? Okay, so yes, all of this time, I'm 40 minutes into this, and I haven't even talked about how to use them. So again, this is actual code. It's certainly out of date right now, but again, from Brand Ghost, which posts things to social media, I have an interface that is supposed to be implemented by the plugins. And how this works is the plugin implementation will say, for example, can I post, so can handle for a given social platform ID. Can I handle it? If it can, so there's other code that we'll be checking for that, which we'll see on the right in just a moment. If it can, then we'll look at calling try post. I'm using my own result pattern, story for a different day. So there is this try to X result pattern kind of thing going on here. And then some other method that my plugin has to implement. But if we look on the right-hand side, I'm using one of my favorite design patterns called the facade. I use facades a lot for plugins. The purpose behind a facade is that it hides complexity. It gives you an API that you might argue that you don't like this one, but it's a it's a simple API from my perspective, and it's hiding the complexity that there's actual like many plugins behind this thing. So when we go to call try post async, what it will do is go look through all of the plugins and say, can anyone handle this? If it can't, this might look weird because it's my result pattern kicking in, but I'm not throwing an exception. I'm just returning an error. And then at the bottom, I'm actually asking the plugin. So handler here in this case is the plugin implementation. I'm saying, hey, handler, post this for me. So this is an example. After we've loaded all of the plugins in through assembly scanning, I have some code in a facade that allows me to do this. So that's me consuming the plugin. Okay, so some of the gotchas, and I want to say it again as a disclaimer, these are some of them, certainly not all. I'm sure if you're watching this, you might have thought of many along the way, and that's great. I'm not getting paid to have people make plugin architectures, so I'm just trying to give you some information. So pros and cons to everything. Please keep that in mind. If anyone's ever telling you they have a perfect solution to something, they're either lying or they don't know what they're talking about. So with that said, you can absolutely increase the complexity in configuration. So I talked earlier about the way that you're testing stuff might, in my opinion, feels better, but then you have other tests you need to consider, right? So if you're dynamically loading things, for example, like you have to make sure that's working. Why are you always dynamically loading things if things are always the same? Can you check for that, right? Like the configuration of the actual binaries becomes a lot more complex. So something to consider. I didn't talk about this at all in the earlier slides, but API versioning complexities is pretty intense. Now, if you're thinking about building web APIs, like these already have versioning challenges. If you're building library code, that can have versioning challenges depending who's consuming it, right? But when you start talking about plugins, I want to give you an example. If in Brand Ghost, I don't, but if I supported 100 social media platforms, and then I said, you know what? I think I want to change the API of that plugin interface. I have to go update, if unless I have a better way to do it, I have to go update 100 different implementations to meet that API. That would not be good. So I would need to find a way to kind of bridge that. But like, it's an extra layer of complexity that we have to consider. Now, that's only me managing that. What if you had third-party plugins? So you have users that have enabled thousands of different plugins for your application, and you go, I think we want to change the API so that it scales with our system properly in our new architecture. I mean, have fun with the versioning. It's just going to be another layer of complexity. I wanted to add in here I call it like a fan out debugging like challenge. So when you're using a facade, this is kind of unique to like facades and plugins being used together. You might be debugging something and you're like, cool, I'm calling this method. And then you step into it and you're going, oh, wait, it's a facade that can potentially branch out to 100 different plugins. Oh, so like now the rabbit hole goes deeper and deeper. So you can have plugins that have their own plugin systems too. So if you keep this pattern going, it can really just start introducing complexity. So something that you need to think about. There are ways to manage this, right? But like, if you have a facade that can branch out to different things, it's probably a little bit more complex on the debugging. Okay, so different cases where I've used plugins. So digital forensic tools. I'm not going to get into all the details of these because it's proprietary and it's been a while. But for digital forensics, we had the ability when you were creating a case for a forensic examiner or an investigator, you have all this data, you want to be able to export it. You want to export it to PDFs, to Excel, to CSV, to different custom proprietary formats. Cool. Okay. That system was plugin based. We're not going to go build, completely separate things when we could leverage plugins to drop into the application in a uniform way. So that was one thing. I ran a team that did mobile device acquisition, and we had the entire application was basically plugin based. But if you think about some of the things we had to do, like we needed to get root access to phones. It's part of what we had to do in our forensic space. So how we do that would be like creating a plugin for that specific workflow for a specific device. And that way we kept the core application the same and we could introduce new workflows like this. And then in forensics, we have this concept of artifact, which is like the application that you're going to be recovering data for. So you might have an artifact for like Snapchat messages or an artifact for your Gmail account, right? So the artifacts themselves are things that would plug into a big search engine. So, one example, Meal Coach is a SaaS that I tried building and it failed. It was a lot of fun, but the whole thing was built with plugins. I leaned into like vertical slice feature sets and had plugins for each of these vertical slices. I think it worked really well in that sense. From a business perspective, not so well. Brand Ghost is a very similar. So I am taking a lot of the learnings from Meal Coach in terms of how the architecture is written. And I've already kind of showed you that code earlier, very briefly, right? But how I can leverage different social media platforms as plugins. And I have this bad history of I haven't done it in a while, but I go back to this role playing game that I started building when I first started programming, and the entire thing, literally every single part of it, is plugin based. Because I have a problem with plugins, I guess. But it's a really fun way for me to use like a sandbox environment for building things with plugins and other design patterns to play around with. So yeah, so lots of experience building stuff with plugins, but I hope that, this list gives you an idea that these things kind of show up in many different places. Okay. I think that's it. I think one more thing before I wrap that up. I just wanted to say one more thing about this part, which is like, if you're asking yourself, like that sounds neat. I like what Nick was talking about. I wonder, do I have a situation where there are plugins? Um, if I go back to the very beginning of this, I like the example of that media converter tool, right? So if you have situations where you're like, I built it for one thing, now I want to build it for another thing, and you're going in your head like, I could probably build this for more things. It might be an interesting opportunity to say maybe those things should be plugins. They don't have to be separated out into different projects. So you might say, hey, Nick, that complexity with the separate projects and building all that stuff out, pain in the butt. I don't want to do it. That's cool. But at least if you look into, uh, separating things out logically for yourself, having a common API, like that's still like a plugin style interface. So that's what I would encourage you to do. If it sounds interesting and you like some of the pros given the cons, like that's how I would approach, is a plugin architecture potential good fit here. Okay, and then just to wrap it up, so I go by dev leader for all my social media stuff. I have courses and stuff on Dome Train. I don't want to necessarily spend time plugging that in this forum, but yeah, I think if you enjoy this kind of stuff and how I approach things, then you can find me on social media talking about similar concepts in the same sort of way, generally with pictures that aren't so bad. So I promise in my other content the pictures aren't so terrible. So thank you so much, and I hope you found that helpful.